Hi everyone. This is a brief video to go over G's foundational concept of discourse with a capital D. Um, I'll keep it brief because we all did really well in discussion board last week. It's a really foundational concept and entailed within it basically because G says, hey, language practices are necessarily social. Because that's the case, talking about discourse with a capital D requires us to sort of talk about these other ideas of literacy, of identity, of enculturation, of inclusion, of exclusion, of authority, of conflict. All of these social ideas come along with G's definition of discourse with a capital D. Last week, we focused on these threshold concepts, one that are going to help us understand how writing scholars think about writing. More importantly, they're going to help us understand how our discourse community uses language in these ways. We know that people use text and writing and language to do something. It accomplishes goals. It's goal-oriented. People also use text and discourse to make meaning, to mediate activities. We know that's basically a fancy way of saying using writing to get something done. And especially this last threshold concept is going to be applicable to the ideas from last week and that we're going to go into more detail of here. That groups of shared text, writing, language, that discourse used by certain communities, discourse communities, they necessarily carry values, beliefs, and ways of thinking. In a lot of ways, that's how we get G's definition of discourse with a capital D. It's language, lowercase discourse, plus social values equals discourse with a capital D. So we need to pay attention. The takeaway from this lesson is that to learn to use a discourse fluently, and I'm going to say should probably be discourse with a capital D, it often means that a user of that language is enculturated to think or value or believe or understand or dress or act in certain social ways, the ways that that discourse community dresses, thinks, acts, etc. Just a review of some of our key terms. I think this expanded definition of literacy is going to be helpful in understanding what it means to be literate in a discourse. Literacy does not just mean alphabetic literacy. That's one literacy, right? Literacy is a fluency in any given practice. To be able to read or write means you're alphabetically literate. To be able to fill out a 1099, know how much money you can withhold, know what the current tax code says for your Roth IRA, to pay your taxes on time and get your maximum refund back means you're economically literate, right? To be scientifically literate means you're fluent in a whole other sets of practices. So when we think of literacies that way, right, it's more accurate to say that we have multi-literacies, that many of us are literate in many different practices and illiterate in some other practices. And we switch between those literacies often, frequently. One of the key takeaways from today is that our identity is also shaped, because identity, believe it or not, is a sort of social values-based thing. And we know that acquiring a discourse is necessarily social. To acquire that, to be literate in that discourse, is going to have some bearing on our identity, our way of thinking, being, acting in the world. It might be subtle, it might be positive, it might be drastic, it might be negative, but in theory, joining a discourse community often involves some change of identity. So I've already trampled all over the definition of discourse with a capital D, but as you know, G's work with discourse with a capital D is so foundational because he expands the traditional idea of discourse of lowercase d, right, which is a set of language or a set of text or a set of communication, right? We might think of um, the discourse of law. It's all of the code. It's all of the documents. It's the formats in which lawyers and judges speak. It sort of entails all of this language use. G goes on to say, no, that's not all of it. We can't simply talk about language without talking about the social aspect that it entails, right? Aside from simply language, writing, and especially aside from simply grammar, discourse with a capital D includes, right, what G says, saying, writing, doing, being, valuing, believing combinations. What he says, right, as an identity kit. He uses that really helpful phrase, a discourse is an identity kit. It's a collection of what forms one's identity. So the key point here, as I said before in this video, any socially useful definition of literacy must be couched in the terms of the notion of discourse. In other words, to become literate in a discourse doesn't just mean learning the language. It entails all this whole other set of social practices that necessarily is probably going to shape or change our identity. Now, G's ideas of primary, secondary, dominant, and non-dominant discourses are really interesting and really helpful for us. He says everyone is born into a primary discourse. This is our original and home-based sense of identity. This is how we don't choose this discourse. We're born into it. So it's how you grew up thinking, speaking, writing, dressing, acting. This is your primary discourse. And then there are secondary discourses. And this is a discourse which we strive to become literate or fluent in. That I really hope that John's reading made clear to us that we are all trying to acquire a discourse with a capital D, and that necessarily entails trying to become members, trying to become accepted, trying to change our identity so that it is similar to the identity of academics. So why is it a secondary discourse? Well, did you grow up making explicit arguments? Did you grow up saying, don't eat that mushroom, it's poisonous, and poisonous things will harm you, so therefore you shouldn't eat it? If you didn't, then academic discourse with a capital D is different from your primary discourse. Why is it discourse with a capital D? Well, think back to everything we've learned up to this point. Sure, we learned that a good thesis should be narrow, it should dig deep, and it should be juicy. It should take risks. We learned those things because, yeah, that's how academics write. But if you think about it, it's beyond just a writing practice. It's a way of thinking, right? Therefore, it's a discourse with a capital D. Academics, they read a piece, they read another piece, and they automatically see the connection as a conversation. They think, oh, Jones is saying X, but Smith disagrees slightly when he says Y, right? So you can see how it's not just a way of writing or using language, but it's a way of thinking. It's a way of understanding the world. We could say, are there values attached to the academic discourse? Absolutely. Probably, just think about the idea of how hard we work to find a specific, narrow, debatable thesis. That suggests to me that academics value risk. We see language as doing something, as accomplishing something. We see argument as doing something, as accomplishing something. And so we want to select a thesis that is worth accomplishing. Okay, sorry for waxing a little poetic there. These ideas of dominant and non-dominant discourse that G bring up are fascinating. They're similar to primary and secondary, except that he says, well, certain discourses have a sort of social prestige and power attached to them, and others do not. I won't belabor these here, but boy, is this a fascinating concept, and boy, would this be maybe an interesting thing to apply to your discourse community. So here are the takeaways from G's reading. Above and beyond, he says, hey, when we study language, we also need to pay attention to the social practices because language is inherently social. All these ideas of identity, membership, exclusion, enculturation, right? Discourses are also ways of being in the world. Discourses give us directions for how to speak, how to write, and more importantly, how to act or think or believe or dress in social gatherings. So, and lastly, G sort of has he's the least certain in how we acquire a discourse with a capital D. He sort of says, well, maybe it's not entirely possible, but maybe it is. Other scholars have disagreed with him about that. But he says, well, one thing we can do is just really have this meta-knowledge, really pay attention and know what sort of values and beliefs and culture are underlying this discourse. And he says, kind of mush fake it. We just have to fake it till we make it. These ideas, of course, are incredibly helpful for us as we move forward and try to actually acquire and become accepted into our secondary discourse, whatever that may be. For all of us, we can say, I think we're all trying to be accepted into a certain academic discourse community. And two, these are incredibly interesting ideas that we can use to make some argument about how our discourse community uses writing, language, right? G's idea of discourse with a capital D can apply to every one of your discourse communities. I guarantee it. John's, we'll go through this briefly, she agrees with G. She kind of says, yep, all discourse communities have a particular language, and this is necessarily social and practice and cultural, right? In a lot of ways, she builds on what G says, but she's particularly interested in the social practices of conflict, authority, identity, membership. So if you're interested in exploring these really social ideas of discourse with a capital D in your discourse community, John's is your can be a foundational secondary source for you as you set up that inquiry. And again, as I said, she looks specifically at the academic discourse community. And I think it's nice. It's almost like an example. She gives a more focused example, takes G's ideas and puts them into practice, asks those questions, applies those concepts to the specific academic discourse community. So the takeaway here is that if I had to put last week's readings into one sentence, it would be that language is necessarily social, therefore acquiring the literacy of any discourse entails all of these social aspects. And these are these are good things to know. One, to help you understand why or why not you are allowed, accepted membership into your desired discourse community, whether it's professional, academic, or hell, whether it's recreational. Even more immediately, this shows us that questions about what it takes to be a member, social practices of our discourse community are totally fair game for our discourse community report. At its most basic, if you want to say, hey, if you want to start out in your research question this week is, what are some of the social and cultural practices of my discourse in my discourse community? Now that's totally valid. We have respected scholarship. We have G and we have John's. We can use those as a foundation to say, all right, G and John say that all discourses are necessarily social. They all have, necessarily undercurrents of certain values or certain beliefs. So I just want to know what those values are in my Dungeons and Dragons discourse community. So really helpful concepts for us this week.